Okay, let's go on with Chapter 10, the last of the chapters we'll be covering for the semester. This is the chapter on social action and social change. Now, this is not by any means a comprehensive listing of all the aspects of social action and change in the history of psychology, but some of the highlights from some of the earlier pieces. The first person we're going to touch base about is a woman named Helen Thompson Woolley. Woolley was generally known for a lot of research in the area of sex differences, but more specifically, at least early on, she was a point of irritation or a source of inferiority to John Watson, of whom we've spoken about a couple of times during the semester. After finishing his qualification exams, and generally speaking what those are, for dissertation work you usually have to submit what we call quals or comps, qualification exams or comprehensive exams. And they're usually done in either the third or fourth year of your academic work. And it's meant to see how much you've learned and retained regarding the field over the course of the previous number of years. And after finishing his qualification exams, which usually involve a written component as well as a verbal component, so that you're asked a series of questions that you have to write about, and then you have to defend those answers verbally in front of a committee of professors. Watson was informed by no less than James Angell, who was his dissertation or doctoral mentor or advisor, as well as John Dewey, that Watson's qualification exams, quote-unquote, paled in comparison, unquote, to Helen Thompson Woolley's. That even included the fact that he was magna cum laude of the group and she was summa cum laude, which meant that she was one step below, essentially kind of like valedictorian and salutatorian. But they informed him in no uncertain terms that her work was superior to his. Helen Thompson Woolley was a functionalist, as were many people, especially if she was working with Angell and Dewey. And her dissertation was, quote, the first attempt to obtain complete and systematic statement of the psychological likenesses and differences of the sexes by the experimental method, unquote. That's a quote from James Angell, who was her dissertation advisor. There's another piece I wanted to read from the book regarding her study. She used 25 males and 25 females and put her subjects through a lengthy battery of sensory, motor, cognitive, and personality tests. She measured almost everything anyone knew to measure in her time, requiring approximately 20 hours of testing for each of her subjects. Now, you don't have to write down all of the stuff I'm going to read from here on out, but I wanted to give you a sense of how comprehensive, at the time, her work was. Thompson's sensory measures included 2-point thresholds, discrimination of lifted weights, taste thresholds, smell discrimination ability, absolute and difference thresholds for pitch, color discrimination, brightness perception, and color blindness. Motor tests included reaction times, tests of coordination, and rapidity of movement. Her cognitive tests measured memory, learning, creativity, and tests of knowledge in subject fields like history, English, physics, and math. Personality measures, tests of emotion, and questionnaires on intellectual interest were also administered. And that's not even a complete list. Thompson found that men were better on most tests of motor ability, but not all. Women did better on some of the coordination tasks. Men showed more creativity. Women demonstrated more acute senses, better memory performance, and the ability to generate more word associations. Quote, the assertion that the influence of emotion is greater in the life of women found no confirmation, unquote. On the whole, Thompson found more similarities than differences in performance, and she found the differences, when they did exist, to be rather small. Okay? In other words, she found more between group differences than she did. She found more within group differences amongst women or amongst men, than she did between group differences between men and women. Okay. A little more piece from the book on this. What did all this mean? Here's how Helen Thompson Woolley summarized her data. The point to be emphasized as the outcome of the study is that, according to our present light, the psychological differences of sex seem to be largely due not to differences of average capacity, nor to difference in type of mental activity, but to differences in the social influences brought to bear on the developing individual from early infancy to adult years. The question of the future development of the intellectual life of women is one of social necessities and ideals, rather than of inborn psychological characteristics of sex. Okay? So in other words, she attributed many of the differences between men and women not to some sort of inherent, inborn psychological difference, but essentially due to social influences, the types of environments that they were exposed to, and the types of things that they were exposed to. Okay, on to the next slide. Sorry, I've got a real itch in my nose. Others' response to her work, people like G. Stanley Hall didn't particularly care for it, and so he mentioned her studies, stating that Miss Thompson becomes feministic in ascribing sexual differences of type of mental action to the differences of the influences that surround the sex in the early years. So Hall was not a particularly big fan of her ideology as to why there were differences. E.L. Thorndike, who in his many books had argued that greater variability among men accounted for their achievements, seemed impressed by the small differences Thompson found. He summarized the results of her studies as follows. The most important characteristic of these differences is their small amount. The individual differences within one sex so enormously outweigh the differences between the sexes in these intellectual and semi-intellectual traits that for practical purposes the sex difference may be disregarded. Now that's impressive. Even though Hall didn't particularly appreciate or speak highly of Woolley's work, Thorndike did. Thorndike actually took her research at face value and appreciated the methodology and the thoroughness of her work, such that he was able to later kind of change some of his viewpoints on it. And so, in many ways, she challenged the stereotypes that people had at the time. And we'll talk a little bit more about the variability hypothesis, but essentially there was an idea that men had greater variability in their overall abilities. That, in other words, in any given ability, intellectual ability, creativity, or so on, that men could range from, let's say, 1 to 100. Okay? Whereas women might only range from 30 to 70. Okay? Which meant that there was a restricted range that women existed in, and that meant that men had a greater chance to do something great because they had that extended kind of, could go up to 100. They also had the greater possibility to be much lower on a particular area. But this was kind of a what we would call an intellectual explanation for what in many ways has also been attributed to social differences, differences in exposure, differences in availability of activities, and so on. Woolley was also a champion in the concept of a child's environment on children's development, and so she was very much about the idea of the environmental impact and the things that people were exposed to and able to engage in as having an early effect on them, and that this effect translated into how they functioned later in life as well. Woolley taught at Columbia for much of her career, was forced to resign essentially because of issues regarding her status as a married woman and whether married women could teach or not, and a lot of kind of, quite honestly, prejudiced views that no longer would hold true. But she was certainly a force to be reckoned with from a research perspective. Now, going back to the research that I mentioned earlier, she only had 25 men and 25 women, but at the time that was a reasonably large N. Now it would be not kind of at the N equals 30 that we often look for, but it would at least be close. And she had extensive testing in a multitude of different areas, which is why someone like Thorndike, who was reasonably geared towards research, took her research as being legitimate and very valid. On to Letta Stetter, who's also Letta Hollingworth, Harry Hollingworth's wife. A little bit of background. She was the valedictorian of her college class, and that included her husband Harry, whom she graduated above. She taught in Nebraska for 3 years and then moved to New York. She wasn't allowed to teach in New York because she was married, and married women weren't allowed to teach. And so she had to find other ways not only to make means, but also to engage what I think was a pretty significant intellect that she had. She and her husband both worked for Coca-Cola, or were contracted out by Coca-Cola, on the effects of caffeine. And I'll give you a little bit of context for that. But the money that they made ended up helping her go through and get her PhD at Columbia, working with E.L. Thorndike. Essentially what happened, and I think we talked a little bit about this in the past when we talked about Harry Hollingworth, but both Harry and Letta worked on behalf of Coca-Cola. Previously, early in the late early 1900s, many different drinks had cocaine in them as a stimulant. And we talked a little bit about Freud's being enamored with cocaine for a multitude of reasons. But Coca-Cola initially had cocaine in it, and the government essentially sued to make them remove it after they placed it on a dangerous substance list. And so they did, but they replaced it with caffeine, which is also a stimulant. It works in somewhat different fashion. It's in a different family of stimulants, but it's still a stimulant. And so essentially the government was going after Coca-Cola to take caffeine out of its formula. And both Letta and Harry worked doing research to show that that caffeine was not addictive in the same way that cocaine was. And the research was found to be, or was seen to be valid, and actually helped. It was one of the primary reasons that Coca-Cola could keep, and to this day most soft drinks do have some form of caffeine in them, because it acts as a stimulant, but doesn't have the same addictive potential as something like cocaine does, at least from the early research. Letta Hollingworth did her dissertation when she was at Columbia, again under the supervision of E.L. Thorndike. Her dissertation had to do with, and this is kind of the overview, hormonal changes due to menstruation, okay, and whether it made women more emotional or cognitively impaired for that part of each month. And the result that she found indicated no. Okay, they didn't cognitively impair women. There may be some increases in emotionality, but those tend to be very small from a statistical standpoint, and that cognitively there wasn't any impairment, which was one of the ideas that had been floating around for many years, and for some people continue to float around now. Okay, I had mentioned the variability hypothesis a few moments ago. Again, this had to do with the idea that men had a greater range of characteristics of any one particular characteristic than women did, which would mean that men would score much higher or could score much lower on any particular ability or aptitude. And that essentially meant that they produced more high-end achievements or accomplishments, which indicated that, generally speaking, it was an underlying way to say that men could be inherently smarter than women because they had this greater range of ability. Well, Hollingworth did research on this and found that this wasn't true, and she did this through investigation through investigating what they called at the time feeble-mindedness, which later became known as mental retardation, birth records, and some other information. And so I'll read a little bit more from the book. This on Letta's dissertation. Sorry, on the variability hypothesis. Here it is. She examined the data for individuals who were institutionalized for feeble-mindedness and found that men were institutionalized at higher proportions. But when she looked at the age of admission, she discovered something very interesting. For those admitted after age 13, the overwhelming majority were female. She explained those differences not in terms of biology, but with regard to the social roles of men and women that would allow mentally retarded women to exist for a longer period of time outside the institution. That is, a longer period of usefulness. Okay? In other words, because of the duties that women often had in the household, that young women girls or young women that had feeble-mindedness, mental retardation, or developmental disabilities, as we refer to it now, could exist in the house for a longer period of time and contribute. And so that accounted for some of the differences, because even at older ages, they could very often continue to engage in certain activities more so than men. Because the responsibilities that men had may be a little bit different than the responsibilities that women had. The end portion regarding her research on the variability hypothesis came out this way. In a critique of the literature supporting the variability hypothesis, Hollingworth found it flawed, confounded, and biased. The few studies that used proper controls and were conducted systematically did not show variability differences. She concluded, as Thompson had a decade earlier, that, quote, even if it were established that there actually is greater male variability in mental traits, it would only suggest, not prove, that there is greater inherent variability. For A, the opportunity and exercise of the sexes have been dissimilar and equal. B, intellectual variability has had survival value for men, but for women it has had little or none. This by virtue of the different parts played by the sexes in the perpetuation of the species. In other words, even if there was greater variability demonstrated by men, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's inherent or based on biology. It could simply be based on exposure or environmental aspects. Okay? And so in the end, they found, not only her research, but many people's research found that the variability hypothesis was very limited. There may be some areas where men did have greater variability than women, but the vast majority of the abilities or aptitudes did not fall in that category. On to a social action issue, and the pictures that you're going to see next are of a man named Kurt Lewin, who I mentioned earlier in the semester is kind of in many ways, a stalwart in the field, one who doesn't get nearly enough credit in many ways. But also, when we were going over Tolman and Clark, in Clark Hull, when we were going over Edward Tolman and Clark Hull, in that one picture where those two have their tongues out, the third person who's on the left-hand side is Kurt Lewin, who we now see. A little bit of background on Kurt Lewin. Lewin was German, fought on behalf of the Germans in World War I. After World War I ended, he went back to school and was a student of Stumpf's, who we talked about earlier in the semester. Even though he fought on behalf of Germany in World War I, Lewin was Jewish, and so as the atmosphere in Germany became less and less tolerant and more dangerous for Jewish people, Lewin left. Lewin left quite early in the 30s. His family actually stayed for much longer. They didn't flee until kind of the late 30s, and much of his family was captured and killed in the concentration camps. But Lewin had left Germany after he got his PhD and worked there for a while and came to the United States. He taught at Iowa initially, then he also taught at Cornell and at MIT, so some pretty big universities. Lewin was a charter member of what is now known as the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, also known as the SPSSI, Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. He was its president in 1941, and actually the highest honor that can be bestowed upon someone by the SPSSI is referred to as the Kurt Lewin Award, and that is the top award that's presented to people, and it's not a yearly award, it's a periodic award that's presented through the SPSSI, and that's because of Lewin's work on behalf of others. Lewin was known for saying that behavior is a function of the interaction of person and environment. Now this seems like a fairly straightforward thing for us currently, and it is a heavy idea of current behaviorism. But at the time, both psychodynamic and behavioral approaches had a heavy focus on historical influences on a person's functioning. So it was contrary to early behaviorism and psychoanalytic ideas. So it was contrary to those, and it was also it also helped shape the views of B.F. Skinner, who later, in later behavioral kind of tenets, the operant condition that we talked about, really talked about the effect of environment in that area. And so current behaviorism really talks a lot about the abilities of a person, or the historical learning of a person, coupled with a person's current environment and how that may shape their behavior as well. Additionally, Lewin felt that it was critical to focus on social determinants. In other words, in aspects of the environment, the social components of an environment. And this becomes, in many ways, really kind of a cornerstone for what we now see as social psychology, and it influenced people like Stanley Milgram, Phil Zimbardo, Solomon Asch in the line studies and so on. So ideas of obedience, conformity, things like that really are heavily influenced by Lewin's earlier work. Lewin was a Gestaltist. Gestalt psychology essentially is one of the precursors to the cognitive revolution, and it really focused on our perception of things and how our perception of things affects the way that we interact or behave towards them. He had a very holistic approach towards things, and so he felt that, like many existentialists did, that the whole was more than the sum of its parts. In other words, there are some things that you can't reductionistically take apart and put back together and really get the full gist or sense of what something is, as we talked about earlier in the semester. He had a legendary group of students that worked with him. Among others, one of his students was a guy named Leon Festinger. Festinger was important because Festinger essentially comes up with the idea of cognitive dissonance. And this is the idea that when we have thoughts or beliefs that don't match up with our behaviors, that causes a lot of consternation or difficulty for people. That when our beliefs and our behaviors don't match up, that we have psychological difficulty. And this happens pretty much across areas. When we aren't quote-unquote true to ourselves, we feel as if we're doing something wrong, and that often results in guilt or shame or depression or anxiety or things like that. Lewin also, apart from being working in the Gestalt area, he had volumes that he wrote about issues regarding racism, prejudice, and stereotype. And that's really why he is so held in such high regard, not only in the social action area, not only by the SPSSI that we talked about before, but by historians in the realm of psychology. From my perspective, top of the class means that he is probably one of the he's grouped in that class of people like Helmholtz and Ebbinghaus, who I don't think get nearly enough credit for the impact of their early research, as well as the stance, in Lewin's case, the stance that he took on social issues because of his experiences in Germany and being a Jew and the loss of his family. He's one of the first psychologists to really take a stance on social issues to a very great extent. And that's particularly true that he's one of the first men to take a stance on social issues. But that's because, in many ways, there was self-interest because of his experience as a Jew. And so he championed the application of psychology for the greater good of humanity, not just individual humans. And so up until now, a lot of what psychology's application had been geared towards really had to do with what worked for individual people. Lewin talked more and championed more the idea of working on behalf of humanity as a whole, and that has to do with being aware of and breaking down stereotypes, prejudice, racism, and religious intolerance, and so on. Okay. The last topic we're really going to touch is the psychology of race. And there's been a long history of some problems regarding psychology's view on race. As we talked about before, Sir Francis Galton, who was influential for a number of people, had some very disparaging views on African Americans, as did G. Stanley Hall. Galton, again, was one of the people who kind of championed the idea of eugenics early on, and in some ways that transposed into his view of very limited breeding of people of color. So both Galton and Hall had very disparaging views, seeing African Americans as inferior both intellectually, personality-wise, that they were more prone to moral weakness and things like that. And then there's a man named R. Mead Botch, or Bache, I'm not sure how you pronounce his last name. He did research on reaction times, and he measured the reaction times, or studied the reaction times, of different groups of people. And what he found is that Native Americans' reaction times were the fastest. They were the shortest, and so they were the quickest. And then African Americans were not too far behind, and then Caucasian Americans were kind of the last of the three. Botch didn't like the idea that whites were inferior, and so he posited that reaction times are more like reflexes, that they were more primitive, and that whites were more contemplative, and that meant that that Caucasian people were more thoughtful, more engaged in intellectual pursuit, and so they may not react quite as quickly because they were trying to understand, take in, and intellectually analyze the multitude of stimuli that they're encountering, whereas Native Americans and African Americans were more primitive and reacting just kind of out of habit, reflex, if you will. This is something that people have referred to as scientific racism. In other words, using science to support the superiority or inferiority of a particular group, particularly when there isn't scientific backing. Now, that is an interpretation of statistical results. People often say that the numbers don't lie, and that's true because numbers don't talk. If the numbers are talking to you, you have a host of other problems going on that are probably better dealt with in therapy or through medication. Numbers don't lie because numbers don't talk, but people do. and people will often interpret things, whether that's intended or not, in ways that support particular ideas or beliefs or contentions that they have. And so while numbers don't lie, people interpret numbers, and that's where we very often can find a variety of responses, some of which can be taken as being racist, prejudiced, biased, and so on. And so that's why Botch's research is often referred to as kind of scientific racism. It's the interpretation of data to support a to quote-unquote scientifically support a belief or contention that really doesn't have much basis. On to a man named Ferguson. The first part right there between Galton Hall and Botch is the ignominy. A little bit of light, that's Ferguson. Ferguson did a variety of tests with African Americans and Caucasians and found that African Americans were good with memory and motor function, weren't particularly good at abstract reasoning. What he felt was that there needed to be follow-up research to try and determine why, but Ferguson also put forth the idea that this may be in many ways due to not only current but historical environmental factors, that concrete things may have been much more psychologically adaptive for African Americans than abstract concepts were. Back to a little ignominy, and for those of you who don't, ignominy means kind of a little bit of shame associated with certain ideas. Louis Terman, the person who revised the Binet-Simon, which became the Stanford-Binet intellectual test, felt that that existing decrements in IQ, or performance in IQ, of African Americans, Native Americans, and Mexican Americans were accurate and a function of biology. And so let me read a little piece from the book here on that, because it says read from book, Dan. Let's see, where is it? Come on. Okay. Where's the Terman piece? Here it is. Terman called for investigation of IQ differences across races, predicting that, quote, when this is done, there will be discovered enormously significant racial differences in general intelligence, differences which cannot be wiped out by any scheme of mental culture, unquote. Okay? In other words, he felt that there would be very strong differences intellectually between the races, particularly with whites performing the best, and that wouldn't be quote-unquote wiped out by any form of mental culture. In other words, that you wouldn't be able to explain them away by reasons of environment or nutrition or other types of impacts. That actually modern research kind of much more strongly supports. Okay. On to some expanding views. There's a man named Floyd Allport. Floyd Allport was a very influential psychologist in the kind of middle portion of the 20th century. Allport puts forth the idea of what he referred to as social inheritance. In other words, that that differences between races had to do with social inheritance, the things that were socially passed down from generation to generation, not a biological kind of inheritance, but a social inheritance, the things that people learned from their parents and grandparents in social contexts about what was and what wasn't appropriate to do or talk about or pursue. So that social inheritance and environmental factors were far more impactful than innate or biological differences. He said that differences do exist, but those differences are not necessarily due to biology. Robert Woodworth, who we talked about before, also was involved in doing and reviewing research in the area. He indicated in his Intro Psychology textbook that there were no consistent differences that could be substantiated through good research between the races. He said that differences tend to be due to confounding variables and cultural backgrounds. and this is in many ways similar to the social inheritance and environmental impacts that Alpert was talking about. This takes us on to a man named Otto Kleinberg. And Kleinberg essentially had two very important texts that he wrote. You don't have to write down the names, but the first one is Negro Intelligence and Selective Migration. Now, this gets in, just like we talked about the variability hypothesis before, to explain away the differences between men and women. Now, that was kind of found to be suspect at best. There was an idea that was put forth called selective migration. Essentially, what people found is that African Americans in the North perform better on tests of intelligence and academics than African Americans in the South. Now, in the North, African Americans were exposed to better school environments. There was less, if any, segregation. African Americans were exposed to the same types of schooling, techniques, apparatus, opportunities as were Caucasian students. Whereas in the South, they had this Plessy versus Ferguson separate but equal idea, where the separate was true but the equal wasn't. And so people came up with the idea that the reason that African Americans in the North did better on these tests of intelligence and academics than African Americans in the South were that essentially the smart African Americans migrated north and the less smart ones migrated south. This was a popular hypothesis for a while. What we ended up finding out is that when research was done, the amount of money given to white schools in the South was 10 times greater than the amount of money given to black schools. And so there weren't nearly as many books that were available. Teachers, there were fewer teachers, and the teachers that were there were not necessarily trained properly. They weren't paid well. And so, in many ways, it was more due to quote-unquote a favorable environment. In other words, African Americans in the North had a more favorable environment for learning than African Americans in the South, and that was the primary reason for the differences in their productivity, in their functioning, and in the results of their tests. So it wasn't that the smarter African Americans migrated north and the less intelligent ones stayed in the South. It was much more of an idea of this quote-unquote favorable environment. In Kleinberg's second book, again, you don't have to write this down, but the second book was referred to as Race Differences. He found no scientific proof of significant racial differences in intelligence. So there's another piece from the book that I wanted to read out. In his second book, Race Differences, Kleinberg wrote, "The general conclusion of this book is that there is no scientific proof of racial differences in mentality. There is no reason, therefore, to treat two people differently because they differ in their physical type. There is no justification for denying a Negro a job or an education because he is a Negro. No one has been able to demonstrate that ability is correlated with skin color or head shape or any of the anatomical characteristics used to classify the races." And it goes on to say that by the time that the 40s came around, sorry, I misplaced my bird bottle, so you won't get any more of those for this semester. By the time of the 1940s, many psychologists were in line with Kleinberg's ideas. The current views include essentially the idea of the effective environment on people's functioning, but there still tends to be discrepancies. There isn't one uniform view. When we look at intelligence, on the whole, Asian Americans or people of Asian descent tend to do the best, particularly Asian men, tend to do the best on IQ tests or tests of intelligence, followed by Caucasians, particularly Caucasian men, and then we see kind of African American, Native American, and Hispanic American, or people of Latino descent falling below that kind of area. Some people see it as being indicative of racial differences, and there was a book that came out in the 90s called The Bell Curve, which was a voluminous text that essentially indicated that that the data doesn't lie, and that we can see it repeatedly over many years. And now that African Americans have the same opportunities as Caucasians, that we can dispel that myth. Truth is that people don't always have all the same opportunities, whether they're African American or Caucasian or male or female or what have you. And so the current view, generally speaking, is that that there may be some innate differences, but the innate differences in and of themselves don't preclude people from being successful or from being academically able. Unless you are so far down in the intellectual scale where we would consider you to be kind of in the developmentally delayed, mentally retarded area, that most people, depending on environmental effects, can succeed in do any host of things. And early on in my career, when I was in graduate school, in doctoral work, I did a lot of testing of impaired professionals, doctors and nurses, but mostly physicians, who went for inpatient substance abuse treatment. And what they found, what we found was that while doctors often had higher IQs than the norm, they didn't have the highest IQs by any stretch. In fact, most doctors had IQs in the 110 to 115 or 20 range, which is about a standard deviation above the norm, but not as high as most people would assume. And that's because being a physician requires certainly a certain amount of intellectual capacity, but what it really requires is a sense of commitment, the ability to memorize and apply voluminous knowledge, and that often requires repetition and commitment, and those are things that aren't necessarily related directly to intellect. And I got that idea from my father when I was younger. He always said he'd much rather have a hard-working individual who was of average intelligence than a very smart person who didn't work hard. This relates, and this is the last kind of slide that you have, to research that was done in school desegregation. As I mentioned before, there was clearly, particularly in the South, a huge disparity between the money that was allocated towards white schools and the money that was allocated towards black schools. And generally it was seen as it was actually, in many cases, went over 10 to 1, but on the whole it was seen as it being about 8 or 10 to 1. So somewhere around 7 to 10 times more money were allocated, 7 to 9 times more money were allocated to white schools than to black schools. But this was true also in graduate work, and so from 1876 to 1920, there were over 10,000 PhDs that were conveyed to white people, almost exclusively white men, whereas there were 11, just 11, for African American people. And so when we talked about Francis Sumner was the first, but he was also one of 11 up until 1920. And this led people to do a variety of research. The first to really do research was Inez Prosser. Inez Prosser was the first African-American woman to get a PhD in psychology, and that was in 1933. Okay? She did research on personality in African-American children and compared them, African-American children in integrated schools versus African-American children in segregated schools, and found that there were some early differences in personality traits and how those personality traits manifested. Unfortunately, Prosser dies in 1934 in a car accident, so her career and her life were cut short, and she wasn't really able to continue on with her early research. Much of this is picked up by Mamie Phipps Clark and Ken Bancroft Clark. The Clarks essentially take Inez Prosser's research and kind of go with it. Mamie Phipps Clark, her initial research, her master's thesis, was on self-esteem, one area of personality, self-esteem in African American children in integrated and segregated schools. And what she found is that the self-esteem for African Americans in segregated schools was much lower than for African Americans in integrated schools. And in many ways, this is related to the stark differences in monetary allocation and environmental kind of stimuli in available apparatus and things like that, that was supposed to be equal under Plessy versus Ferguson, but it clearly wasn't. Both Mamie Phipps Clark and Kenneth Bancroft Clark get their PhDs from Columbia. Ken worked with Otto Kleinberg. Mamie Phipps Clark worked with a man named Garrett. But both of them worked in the area of segregation and the effects of differential environmental opportunities on functioning, particularly academic functioning of children. They also both worked with the NAACP and were brought in as expert witnesses for testimony by a man named Thurgood Marshall, who you guys might know as later on he was a Supreme Court justice. But at the time he was an attorney for the NAACP, and he brought them in as expert witnesses because of the voluminous work they had done regarding the effect of segregation on the development of African American children. Essentially, he wanted to show that segregation was damaging to African American children, and through the Clark's research, they were able to make that case effectively. This essentially overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, and this led to what we now see as Brown versus the Board of Education. That threw out the separate but equal and talked about making sure that all people had equal access, or that the playing field was level educationally, at least for public schools. And so I'm going to read a little piece of this out to you, and this is kind of the last thing for us. Here it is. Shortly after noon on May 17, 1954, the press corps at the court was notified that a decision was about to be registered in the Brown case. Chief Justice Earl Warren read the decision, which in part stated, quote, "Segregation of white and colored children in public school has a detrimental effect upon the colored children. The impact is greater when it has the sanction of law, for the policy of separating the races is usually interpreted as denoting the inferiority of the Negro group. A sense of inferiority affects the motivation of the child to learn. Segregation with the sanction of law, therefore, has a tendency to retard the educational and mental development of Negro children and to deprive them of some of the benefits they would receive in a racially integrated school system. Whatever may have been the extent of the psychological knowledge at the time of Plessy versus Ferguson." By the way, Plessy versus Ferguson occurred in the 1890s. Whatever may have been the extent of psychological knowledge at the time of Plessy versus Ferguson, this finding is amply supported by modern authority. We conclude that, in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Okay? And so, in large part because of the work of the Clarks and their ability to talk about that in very solid methodological and research-based terms, they were able to establish, or at least indicate, that segregation had a detrimental effect on the functioning and on the personality, on the self-esteem, and on the functioning of African American children. And this became one of the more important Supreme Court cases, certainly of the 50s, but essentially and it continues to be an issue now when we get into busing and things like that. But it had the effect of leveling the playing field. Now, often this is seen as being a racial issue, and in many ways it is, but what we're talking about is giving people equal access, whether those are men or women, people that are African American or Caucasian or Asian American or Latino descent or what have you. And so this was a quantum shift in not only in the views of education, but in the use and application of psychological research to affect public policy and to affect a social change. Okay, that's it for this chapter, and that's it for your third test. So your third test will be based on these web-based lectures, chapters 8, 9, and 10. Okay, you will have, since I won't be there, you'll have primarily multiple choice, and then you'll also have 3 essays. The essays will be, I think, in many ways, you should probably do fine with them. This is the only piece that will be quote-unquote cumulative, in that you'll have to be able to talk about some of the more important people as you see them from the first and second parts of the course, as well as from the third parts of the course. So in some ways you can think of the last essay that you've had on your first 2 exams, and try and think about what those questions were, and how that might apply to the essays that you'll have on your last exam. Without me telling you exactly what the questions are, I hope that you can figure that out. Okay. This video will be up before this Thursday, the 5th of April, and so any questions you have, I'll be available through email, and I wish you guys the best of luck, and if you have any questions, email me, and this is the end of our lecture. So it's been a pleasure having you all in class. I'm sorry I wasn't able to be there live for you guys over the last couple of weeks, but some people may prefer this because they can watch it whenever they want. So email if you have any questions, and good luck in our class. Remember, you can submit your readings through the assignment portions. 7 through 10 there are individual links for, but if you wanted to submit other ones, you can just link them all in on assignment 7, and that wouldn't be a problem. Just kind of put them on one big file and attach it to assignment 7, as well as your final paper. You can also submit that through Blackboard, and those are all up under the assignments portion on Blackboard. I'll be checking extra credit for the SONA system at the end of the semester, so the last day of classes, probably the end of that week is when it'll stop, and then I'll be able to check it. I'll put that up that weekend, and any discrepancies you have, you can email me and let me know. Any questions? Shoot me an email. Alright? Talk to you later, guys.